This story begins in a quiet little town where time seemed to move slower. The kind of place where everyone knew your name and your business. It's here that a young woman named Camille found herself sorting through her great-aunt Essie's belongings after her passing. Now, Aunt Essie was known for two things: her sharp tongue and her mysterious ways. She kept to herself, rarely sharing much about her life, but those who got close to her swore she had a connection to something otherworldly. Some said it was just her eccentricity. Others believed it was the spirits whispering in her ear. When Camille inhabited Aunt Essie's house, she was determined to uncover the truth about her great-aunt's strange life. But what she didn't expect was to find a small sealed jar tucked away in a locked drawer in the attic. The jar was simple, a bit of cloudy glass, sealed tight with wax and twine. Attached to it was a note, written in Aunt Essie's neat, spidery handwriting. It read, "Do not open. Whatever you're looking for isn't worth what you'll find." Camille laughed to herself, thinking it was just another one of Aunt Essie's odd quirks. But the warning lingered in her mind as she held the jar in her hands. The weight of it felt unnatural. That night, she placed the jar on the fireplace mantel and went to bed, thinking nothing more of it. But as the clock struck midnight, Camille woke to a faint sound, a whisper. At first, she thought it was the wind, but as she lay there, holding her breath, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They were coming from the direction of the mantel. The next morning, Camille tried to brush off the eerie sounds, telling herself it was just her imagination. But curiosity began to gnaw at her. What could possibly be inside the jar? And why had Aunt Essie gone to such lengths to seal it? By the third night, the whispers became clearer. They weren't just noises. They were words. Camille could hear her name being called, soft and drawn out, like a lullaby wrapped in shadows. Camille. Camille. Unable to ignore it any longer, she took the jar down from the mantel and held it in her hands. The whispers grew louder, and the glass seemed to pulse with warmth. Against her better judgment, Camille reached for a knife and carefully cut through the twine and wax. The moment the seal broke, the whispers stopped. The room grew unnaturally still, and a cold breeze swept through the house, even though the windows were shut. At first, nothing happened. Camille peered inside the jar, but it was empty. Just a bit of dust clinging to the bottom. She laughed nervously, feeling silly for letting her imagination run wild. But as she set the jar down, the air around her shifted. A faint shadow began to form in the corner of the room, growing darker and more defined with each passing second. Camille froze. Her breath caught in her throat as the shadow took shape. It wasn't a person, not exactly. Its form was distorted, its edges flickering like the flame of a candle. The whispers returned, louder and sharper now, filling the room with a cacophony of voices. And this time, they weren't calling her name. They were demanding something. "Put it back. Seal it. Seal it." Camille stumbled back, knocking over a chair in her panic. She grabbed the jar, her hands trembling, and tried to reseal it with the broken wax, but it was no use. The shadow lunged toward her, its presence suffocating, pressing down on her chest like a weight. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Camille opened her eyes to find herself alone in the room, the shadow gone, the jar cold and lifeless in her hands. But the house felt different, heavier, darker, as if something had shifted. The next morning, Camille packed up the jar and took it to the town's oldest root worker, Miss Ida May, a woman who had known Aunt Essie well. Miss Ida May's face grew pale as she examined the jar. "You opened this, didn't you?" she asked, her voice low. Camille nodded, shame washing over her. Miss Ida May sighed deeply. "Child, this jar wasn't meant to be touched. It was a binding, a prison for a spirit that shouldn't walk free. Your Aunt Essie knew what she was doing when she sealed it. Now, you've let it loose." Camille felt a chill run down her spine. "What can I do? How do I fix it?" Miss Ida May shook her head. "Some things once broken can't be put back. But you'd best watch your back, child. Spirits like that don't forget who freed them." Camille left the jar with Miss Ida May, but the weight of her mistake stayed with her. She sold Aunt Essie's house and moved far away. But even then, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. Some nights, when the wind was just right, she swore she could still hear the whispers, faint and distant, calling her name. "Camille, Camille." Ah, my beautiful souls, some warnings are given not to scare us, but to save us. Aunt Essie knew the weight of that jar, the cost of its contents. But sometimes curiosity blinds us to the wisdom of those who came before. So, the next time you're faced with a mystery wrapped in a warning, ask yourself, is it worth the risk? Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and as always, stay rooted.